All right, John chapter 10. Looks like we do have good sound. And John chapter 10. And let's see here. Make sure. Okay, yeah, we're getting good sound here. All right. Let me turn it down so that I'm not picking up any. All right, John chapter number 10. Sitting on a different side. This is going to take me a few minutes to get used to, that's for sure. And all right, John 10. We're going to read the first 6 verses, make a few comments about the chapter, and hopefully see how all of this connects, or at least introduce how all of it's connecting. And it is a lot of information on the outline tonight, but we'll just see what we can do. But in verse number 1 of John 10, it says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. And when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. And a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. This parable spake Jesus unto them, but they understood not what things they were which he spake unto them." And then it continues in verse 7. Beginning in verse 7, he starts giving explanation. Now, chapter 7, 8, and 9, and 10 are all connected, okay? They're all taking place in, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks or so time period. And I say 3 weeks or so, it's actually not even that. It's probably closer to about a week and a half. John chapter 7, he is in Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. John chapter 8 is seems to pick up on the last day of that feast. He declares he's the light of the world. John 9 is in all likelihood that same day. It appears the beginning of 9 is the same day of John 8, and then later on in that week, John 9 continues with the discussion of the blind man. Then we come here to chapter 10, and in chapter 10, Jesus is revealing a special relationship that they can have with Jehovah. Now, he comes here in verse 10, or chapter 10, and according to verse 6, he's giving them a parable. This parable spake Jesus unto them. So what we have in verses 1 through 6 is the proclaiming of a parable. Now, John doesn't ever go into detail as to why he ever speaks to them in parables. John doesn't do that. Matter of fact, John really doesn't ever give any parables by the Lord. This is really the first parable that he gives, or is the parable that he gives. But I think it's really interesting that the Lord is giving a parable. We'll kind of dive into a little bit deeper things on this, but as review, I want to review with us, as it were, what not just what a parable is, but what is going on with a parable. So, why does the Lord give a parable? What is the reason for giving this parable? What is the reason for this? Now, in order to know the reason for giving any parable, okay, I want us to turn back to Matthew. Turn to Matthew chapter 13. Now, in Matthew 13, we have the reason for the parables. He tells them. Now, I know it sounds, I don't want to sound redundant in going through this, but I think once we see all the pieces here, it'll help us to understand why in John he's giving this parable. But in Matthew 13, verse 10, Matthew 13 and verse 10, the Bible says, "And the disciples came and said unto him, Why speakest thou unto them in parables?" Why are you speaking to them in parables? Okay. So then he gives them the answer. The answer is this. He answered and said unto them, Because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. For whosoever hath. Now, what is this idea about whosoever has or hath? Okay. The context, if we look back at verse number 9, we know what this hath is. If you look at verse 9, he says, who hath ears to hear, let him hear. So the hath is about ears. So if you get down to go back to verse 12, for whosoever hath, you could even imply whosoever has ears to hear, okay, let him hear, but whosoever hath, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whosoever hath not, so whoever does not have ears, from him shall be taken away even that he hath. So the one that does not have ears to hear, what little bit he does have is going to be taken away from him. So those who do have ears to hear, more is going to be given to them. And those who do not have ears to hear, what they do have is going to be taken away. Therefore, verse 13, speak I to them in parables, because they, seeing, see not, and hearing, they hear not, neither do they understand. Now, this is interesting. He says, they see and they hear, but they don't see and they don't hear. And then he says in verse 14, and in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which said, by hearing ye shall hear and shall not understand, and seeing ye shall see and not perceive. So in other words, I'm giving them parables. Something is going to be fulfilled in them. And what is being fulfilled? Well, they're hearing, but they're not going to understand. They're seeing, but they're not seeing. And that's all about these parables. Why? Okay, he gives the answer. So why is he giving them parables? Why are they not seeing? Why are they not hearing? Why are they not understanding what is going on? He tells them in verse 15, for this people's heart is waxed gross. It's grown thick. And their ears are dull of hearing. And their eyes they have closed. Lest at any time they should see with their ears and hear with, lest at any time they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. Now, verse 15 is all about the prophecy from Isaiah. Okay, so what we have is that Jesus Christ speaks to them in parables because they should hear and because they should see, but they're not. And the reason they're not is because their hearts have become hard. They have closed their ears and they have closed their eyes. And so then God is giving them these parables so that they will remain in that state of not understanding. Now it says, well, why is that? Okay, because it's a part of judgment from God. They have said no to God, and so now God is judging them by not allowing them really to see and to understand. Now, okay. Let me see. I want to see. No, we won't worry about reading the other part here of this. Okay. So what is the reason for the parable? Okay, the reason for the parable is that they should see, but they're not. They should hear, but they're not. They're not seeing, they're not hearing, they're not understanding, they're not grasping what God is giving to them. Why? Because they are saying no to God. Okay, so now we can turn back to John 10. We'll turn back to John 10. So the reason for any parable that Christ gives is for that reason. Okay, so keeping that in mind. Right, the reason he gives parables. And so in giving a parable, there's a revelation. There's something he desires to reveal in the parable. Okay, now, I'm not. So what I'm going to give you now, this is not the revelation, the specific thing in the revelation. What he is revealing through the parable, he is giving them an earthly message. Okay, it's something that relates to the earth. Here it's sheep and shepherds and thieves and robbers and a door and a stranger and sheep following and all of these things. Okay, this is a true earthly story, a true earthly thing. This actually really does happen, things like this. But the revelation is that it's not the the message is earthly, but the meaning is heavenly. There's a spiritual meaning. And so in the Old Testament, whenever a parable is given, there's always this earthly message to it. There's a earthly message being conveyed, but the meaning is much deeper than that. Okay, so the revelation in this parable, it goes deeper, I know, but the overall revelation for this parable, the earthly message are sheep, shepherds. The heavenly meaning is that these Pharisees are not the true shepherds of Israel. But that as we study this out, we'll see that Jesus is the true shepherd and they are not. Okay, that is the revelation. And he is comparing them to these thieves and robbers and to these strangers. Okay, that is the revelation. This is where he's going to go. Okay. Now, what is the response to the parables? So there's two responses to parables. Okay, typically when I say typically, another response would be, they're going to listen to this later. But I want you to notice the first response is seen in verse 6, and that is a lack of perception. This parable spake Jesus unto them, but they understood not what things they were which he spake unto them. So the response is they didn't get it. There's a lack of perception. Okay, but a very, very interesting thing happens. When Jesus Christ begins to explain, beginning in verse 7, all the way down through verse number 18, okay, we come to verse number 19. And this is very interesting. After he explains the parable, okay, there's a lack of perception, but then there is a looking at the person. Now, this is what is interesting. Verse 19, again, there was a division. Therefore, again, among the Jews. Now, isn't this very interesting? Jesus in chapter 7 brought division. Chapter 8 he's bringing division. Chapter 9 he's bringing division. Chapter 10 he's bringing division. Why? This is why. Many of them said, he has a devil and is mad. The word mad in the King James Bible means crazy. Not like angry, but like mad, like he's crazy. Why hear ye him? Now, remember what I said, the tactics of the Pharisees, and not just the tactics of the Pharisees, but anytime that anyone is being backed into a corner, and I know I've been saying this a lot, I don't even know why, it's just something that popped in my head a while back, but you start dropping truth bombs on them, they're these bombs of truth. What do? They deflect from themselves, and they cause you to question your sanity. There's a deflecting from self and a denial of sanity. What do they do here? He is just telling them in these things, you're a bunch of strangers and thieves and robbers. I am the true shepherd. And he tells them that I am the shepherd and I am the door. So then what do they say? He has a devil. They deflect it from themselves and he is mad, and they deny and say, this guy's crazy. Why are you even listening to him? But notice the division though. Others said, these are not the words of him that has a devil. These are not the words of a man that's possessed. Can a devil open the eyes of the blind? And so what happens? You have those that are, remember the purpose of parables. You have those that have ears to hear, and they have, and more is going to be given to them. And then you have those that they do not have, and what has been given is going to be taken away. We see that right here. Some of these Pharisees are just so, and these Jews are so blind and hard-hearted. They're saying, nope, he's crazy. Others are saying, but wait a minute though. Okay, so maybe he's saying some things that we don't, okay, but these are not the words of someone who's possessed. And can a man possessed do these works? And so they're opening their eyes. They're opening their ears. They're opening their heart to hear what Christ has to say. And many of these will come to faith. And we see that in the book of Acts. All right, many of the Pharisees came to faith. Priests and all of that, they come to faith and trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, now that's the proclaiming of the parable. Now, what is the purpose of this parable? Now, I know we've already looked at the reason, okay, in a little bit, but why this parable? Okay, why this? And I know that sounds a bit odd, but I mean these are questions that I ask. All right, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking to myself, why is the Lord doing this? Like, what in the world? Why? I mean, why is He bringing this in? So, a couple of things here. The first thing I want you to consider, okay, is the context of the parable. Now, okay, and I know, and this is going to sound like not harsh, but like demeaning, and it's not intended to be, because this is just, when I say the casual reader of the Bible, and I say that because we should all just be casual readers, like just read the Word of God. And so when I say the casual reader, a lot of times we miss this in casually just reading the Bible. I mean, because, so I'll ask you a question. What chapter are we in? We are in chapter 10. Okay. And what chapter comes before that? Chapter 9. Okay. So when we're reading a book, and we're reading, a chapter book, usually the events in one chapter ends and then a new chapter begins and something new happens. Okay. So, well, when the Bible was translated, okay, and it was translated into English, okay, the chapters, John did not actually put chapter 10 in the Bible. When it was translated later on, when they translated it from the Greek and the Hebrew, and they're translating it, and then we eventually get over into the English language and things like that, they put chapters in. And then they put the little verse numbers in so that it would be easier to find things for us. Okay, so chapter 10 is actually connected to chapter number 9. Now, we can know this and we can recognize this because of the first two words in John chapter number 10. Okay, the first two words of John 10 and verse 1 are, verily, verily. Now, in the Gospel of John, John never begins a new topic with verily, verily. When Jesus is speaking and Jesus uses the word verily, verily, those words mean truth, truth, or truly, truly. So he's saying, truly, truly, I say to you. I'm giving you truth. I'm giving you truth. That's what the word verily means, okay? When Jesus uses these words, he never uses these words at the beginning of a brand new thought. Now, the reason why I am mentioning this is that the thought of chapter 10, verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same as a thief and a robber, picks up from verse number 41, when he says, if you were blind, ye should have no sin, but now you say, we see, therefore your sin remaineth. Truly, truly, I say to you, if he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same as a thief and a robber. So the purpose of this parable is seen in the context of the verse. Okay? Now, what is the context? Okay, what is the context of the parable? The context in the parable leads to the next thought, and it is because of the condition of the people. Now, what is the condition of the people? All right, so if we remember the reason why there's a parable, there are those that have, and more is being given to them through the parable, and there are those that do not have, and so what they do have is being taken away through the parable. They're going to be even more blinded. Okay. So what is the condition of these people? All right. So look back at verse 39 of chapter 9. Okay. This is where the Lord begins his thing. This is where this is the condition of the people. Verse 39 of chapter 9. And Jesus said, for judgment, to give a verdict, I am come into this world. And what verdict am I going to pass? It is that they which see not might see, and that they which see might be made blind. Now, and I tried to explain this last week. So what this means, or what this is is that those that do not see, like the blind man, are healed by Jesus. Okay, they're able to see, and those which do see might be made blind. Okay, now the idea of this, okay, and I know this may sound a little tricky or odd, but what Jesus is expressing is that those that cannot see and they know that they are blind, I have come to heal them. Why is he coming to heal them? Because they know that they're blind. They want to be healed, just like this blind man, and they need to be able to see. But those that do see, they have these eyes, and the idea of this is that they are professing that they can see. He's saying, I've come to make you blind. Okay, and so that statement gets the reaction or the response that the Lord is desiring from these Pharisees in verse 40. And some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words and said unto him, are we blind also? And are you accusing us of being blind, or are you accusing us of not being able to see? And then that's when the Lord responds in verse 41, well, if you were blind, if you could not see, if you did not see, then you would have no sin. But now ye say, you are saying that you see, therefore your sin remains. Now, so he gives a parable, or he's giving parables to those who are refusing to hear and heed the word of God. Again, this goes back to verse number 39. He has come to open the eyes of those who are blind, and they know it. They know they're blind, so he's come to open their eyes and to blind the eyes of them that say they can see, and yet they are rejecting him. If they could truly see, then they would not reject him. That's the point. Their true condition is that they are blind. And so what is the purpose of this parable? The purpose of the parable is to show them that they are blind. It is to show them their true condition. It is to and so that which is what makes this so very interesting is that when you get to the end of it and to the end of the explanation of the parable, half of them are still rejecting Jesus, and then the other half are like, wait a minute, this guy's, how is this guy not telling us the truth? How is this guy not sent from God? And so the purpose of the parable is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. That those who are blind, in verse number 41, they say that they see, but they actually are blind, and they're worse. And then the idea, of course, is verse 41 is that people are going to be held accountable for what they know and understand. And if they truly did not understand, they would not be held accountable. But they're saying that they do, and because of that, they're still in that sin. So the purpose of this also is seen in the connection with the people. Now, although the Jews and Pharisees will not understand this, there is a great connection here. The connection with the last chapter is seen in the poor perception of themselves. Now, remember, they are blind. They think they see, and they're even professing that they see, but Jesus is showing them that they are actually truly blind. They are blind to their condition, and their condition has led to a misrepresentation of themselves. In chapter 9 and verse 41, the Lord tells them that they are still in their true condition. They're still in sin, is the point. You're still in sin. Okay, this is their true condition. Now, what is their misperception of themselves? And so I thought about this, and so there's a couple of thoughts here. And this parable is revealing their misperceiving, or what they're missing is their perception or their perceived reality. Now, as we will see, the parable is about shepherds leading their flocks. It's about so if you look at verse number let's look at verse 1 and verse number 2. So he says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, there was only one way to come in. But the one that climbeth up some of the way, the same as a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep." Verse 3, "To him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he called his own sheep by name, and he leadeth them out." So, so their reality, their perceived reality, is that they have this authority that they're able to walk in and lead these sheep. And so through this parable, Jesus is going to reveal to them that they are not the true shepherds of Israel. They are shepherds, but they're misleading them. They're not the true shepherds of Israel. But then he's also revealing their perceived relationship. They think that they have a relationship with the people of God. They are the leaders, and the people are following them. But just as the shepherd leads the flock with their voice, okay, he knows their voice and the sheep follow them, these men believe that they have a relationship with these people. And so this is the perception, their misperception of themselves. They're missing there's a perceived reality that they're missing and a perceived relationship. They think that they have this authority, they have this ability, and this special relationship, and they do not. Okay, now, so we come to the parable, okay, and really this, we're going to go through the parable very quickly, very quickly on this. And so notice the picture of the parable, and we'll get into the deeper meanings of these things in verse 7 through 18 next week and things. But I want us to look at the picture of the parable. All right, Jesus is giving this parable to them, and he is revealing two very interesting facts. Okay, he's giving the signs, the true signs, or the signs of the shepherd, the true shepherd, and then he gives the signs of the strangers, and we'll get into the strangers in verse number 5. And so there are some aspects of this parable that we really shouldn't, we don't need to look into absolutely every single minute detail of the parable, okay? Because the Lord is contrasting himself as the true shepherd of Israel with these Pharisees and these Jewish people. And that's what he's doing here. He is revealing this to them in their blinded states. So let's look at the signs of the shepherd. What are the true signs of a shepherd, and a true type or a picture of those that are, the true leaders and shepherds of the people of God? We see this in verses 1 through 5. If you wouldn't, in verse 1 now, and so some of this is, when I say in principle, again, he's contrasting strangers with himself, okay? In verse 1 and 2, the first sign of a shepherd is that he has access to the sheep. Now, I know we just read it, but we'll read verse 1 again. He says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, truly, truly, I am telling you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same as a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter openeth." Now, this is very important in understanding the relationship that the shepherd has with the sheep. Now, this is not only limited to Jesus Christ as being the true shepherd, but this applies to any of those who will lead his sheep, especially later on. Now, the shepherd comes in through the door. Now, most of us are not going to be familiar with sheepfolds, and we're not going to be familiar with this concept, okay? And so in this area, what they would have is they would have a large, maybe a circle, maybe a rectangular shape, a square shape, but it's a sheepfold. It would have sides. It would have a front where there's one door. It would have walls, maybe block or rock, some type of fencing. There'd be a door to come in, and then it would go to the sides and then back to the back. And it's usually open. And sometimes the sheepfold would be connected to like a house, a place for, people could go in and things like that. And sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. And they would have a back. And the only way to be able to go into the sheepfold is straight through that door. They could climb over it. They could. It was accessible that way. But what the Lord is doing is saying that the true shepherd doesn't have to climb up through the sides. He doesn't have to sneak in. He doesn't have to do anything of that nature. The shepherd of the sheep has access to them. He can go right in. He can get his sheep, and then he can go right out. Okay, there's only one way in through that fold, okay? And that is through the door. Very important. We'll look at that. But he has access to the sheep, okay? Thieves and robbers do not. It's very important. They have access to the sheep. Secondly, in verse 3 and 4, in verse 3, notice the attending by the sheep. Now, another sign of the shepherd is that the sheep would hear the shepherd's voice. Now, if you look at verse 3, he says, to him the porter openeth. Why? Because the shepherd has access. And the sheep hear his voice. And he called his own sheep by name, and he leadeth them out. Okay, verse number 4, they know his voice. Verse 5, a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. Notice the attending by the sheep. Now, what is the implication of why this is important? Is that the sheep will hear the voice of the shepherd, and they know that voice. Okay, now I have never had any dealing with sheep. Okay, like I never have. The closest thing that I ever came is a petting farm, and you can go pet sheep, They smell and they're fluffy. If they've not been shaved, they're usually, their wool can get matted, and yeah, okay. I have no dealings with sheep, all right? So what I know about the relationship between a shepherd and a sheep is what I have read and testimonies of those that deal with them. But this is something that every person that has ever dealt with sheep, that they know. In these sheepfolds, you may have 3 or 4 different flocks of sheep. An average size of flock might be 100 sheep. So if you have 3 to 4 flocks, that's 300 to 400 sheep. They're all milling around, making noises and things like that. When that shepherd walks into the fold, the sheep don't really pay attention. They're not looking at him. But as soon as the shepherd calls his sheep, and he has some way to call them, some kind of noise, maybe a word, a phrase, his sheep will stop and they will listen to his voice. Now, again, what's the point? The sign of a true shepherd, the sign of the shepherd is the sheep hear his voice. Notice, if you would, in verse number 3, the affection for the sheep. The affection for the sheep. Now, notice what he says in verse 3. To him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice. This is very important. And he calleth his own sheep by name. Now, in this, we see the sign of affection. He calls his sheep by name. This is very powerful. And this is so very true from what I have read. The shepherds would name each of their sheep. Okay, now how you can tell a sheep apart, I have no idea. But the shepherds do. They're able to do that. I don't know. Usually what they would do is they would give, many shepherds would give a name for that sheep. Maybe it was a characteristic. Maybe this sheep has long ears. He would call them long ears. Maybe he has a spot on his nose. He has a spotted nose. Maybe I don't know, maybe the sheep limps, whatever it is. He gives a name, and it's like a pet name, a nickname. It could be, it could be hardhead. Maybe there's a sheep that is just really hard-headed, and there are sheep that are hard-headed. They'll listen to the shepherd, but they'll just wander off and, hey, hardhead, come back, and whatever it is, but he knows them. What's the point? What's the sign of affection? The sheep was not just an animal, but something very special to the shepherd. Okay, usually the family, it was a family run thing, right? And so these sheep would be just as close as family. I mean, we even do that with our pets, our dogs and our cats. I mean, we treat them like family. We take care of them. We're sad when they're hurt or die. And so, but these shepherds, this is not just their livelihood. This is what they are. This is who they are. The affection for the sheep. So a sign of the shepherd is that he shows affection for them, which is very interesting. How many times do we read in the Gospels Christ saw them with compassion as sheep having no shepherd, and yet what do we always see the Pharisees doing? They're not attending to them. They took advantage of the poor. They took advantage of the widows. They took advantage of these people, putting more and more bondage on them. All right. Notice the accountability toward the sheep. This is very interesting as well. These are all signs of the shepherd. Now look at verse 3 again, in verse 3 and 4. He says, to him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth, notice this, his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. Verse 4. And when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him. Verse 5, and a stranger will they not follow, but you will flee from them, for they know not the voice of strangers. Notice the accountability toward the sheep. Now, what is this? A very interesting concept. Again, the Lord reveals a very powerful truth concerning the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep. And what is that? The relationship and the emphasis is on how the shepherd leads those sheep. Notice in verse 3, he leads them out. He leaded them out. Verse 4, he puts them out, and the idea that he is putting them. Sometimes the word has the idea of like pushing them out, but it's not. That's not the idea of the word like he's picking them up and just throwing them out. No. The idea is that he's leading them and he's placing them outside of the fold. And then once he does that, what does he do? He goes before them. And what happens? They follow him. Now, the idea of this ties into the affection that the shepherd has for the sheep. He loves them, and in so loving them, what does he do? He provides for them. And the reason why I said this shows the accountability that the shepherd has towards the sheep, he is taking responsibility. He is accountable for their well-being. He is accountable for their well-being, not because the sheep really do anything for him. I mean, he gets wool and he gets maybe some other things he's able to sell, but that's not what he's doing. That's not it. He loves them. He has affection for them, and because of that affection, he is accountable to them. But I love this also. Notice the attachment. These are all signs of the true shepherd. And what the Lord is going to do in the following verses is show how he does this. And it is revealing why so many people were beginning to turn from the Pharisees. Notice the attachment for the sheep. In verse 3 and 4, I know I keep reading these over and over, but these are just different concepts that I see, okay? Verse 3, to him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name and leadeth them out. Verse 4, and when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. Notice Jesus uses the word own. They are his own sheep. He is attached to them. This is closely associated again with the affection of the sheep, and which leads to the accountability for the sheep. But the shepherd is attached to them. This shows us a special relationship that the shepherd has for his sheep. And then ultimately, this is the special relationship that Jesus has for his people. The shepherds at this time were very fond and very much attached to their sheep. They were as close to, these sheep were just as close to these the shepherds were just as close to these sheep as they were with their own family. Later on, we're going to read that the true shepherds, would lay down their life for their sheep. I read several stories where this actually happened, where robbers, the robbers of verse 1 and 2, and the strangers of verse number 5, that many times the shepherd would be out walking with his sheep, and robbers would come and would attack him to try to take the flock. And that many shepherds would actually die in defending their sheep. Wild animals would come. We read in the Old Testament about David killing the lion and the bear when the lion and bear tried to take his sheep. Many shepherds actually died defending their sheep. There's a great attachment. And so the shepherds have access. The sheep they attend. He has great affection for them. He calls them by name. He is very accountable to them. He leads them. He's very attached. They're his own. He's taking ownership of them. And taking ownership of them is very concerned about their well-being. But now notice the signs of the strangers. The Lord contrasts this. There's only three things here really that I was focusing on, and what the Lord is doing here. I know we may not see it right away, but remember, he's talking to these Pharisees. They think he's showing them that they're blind. They think they can see, and it's like, well, if you can see, then your sin is still there. And so they're not seeing him, and they're missing it. So what are the signs of a stranger? What are the signs of those that are not the true shepherds of the sheep? If you look at verse number 1, it says, verse 1, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber." I want you to notice, number 1, the first sign of a stranger, the first sign of someone that is not a true shepherd, is a disregard for the sheep. Completely disregard them. And he said, "Brother, how in the world?" Notice those who are not true shepherds try to enter the sheepfold by climbing over the sides. Well, okay, sure, but this is the point. They are thieves and robbers. These robbers and those that are, and these thieves, what are they doing? They're trying to sneak their way in, and they are trying to take advantage of the sheep. They're taking advantage of the sheep and their helplessness. They are not concerned for the well-being of the sheep at all. They are only concerned about themselves. And so a sign of a stranger is a lack of concern for the sheep themselves. They're sneaking in. They're taking advantage of the sheep. They're the old saying, they're wolves in sheep's clothing, and we've all seen cartoons or comic strips or whatever where, you have the sheep, he's got the wolf's got the sheep skin on. They made this funny cartoon. It was like an animation thing years ago called Hoodwinked, about Little Red Riding Hood, and it's telling the story of Little Red Riding Hood in like this really funny way. I mean, it's really a comical thing. And in that the wolf is disguised as a sheep. And it's like that. There's this wolf standing there, and he's talking to these other sheep, and he's got this skin on. Okay, well, what is the point here? They're sneaky. There is no regard for the sheep's well-being. A total disregard. And so what is the sign of a stranger? There's no regard for the well-being of the sheep. They don't care. They don't care. Secondly, it's found in verse number 5. And they use the word stranger. "And a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him." Now notice the sign of a stranger. Notice the displacement of the shepherd. Now notice what these strangers are trying to do. They are trying to lead the sheep. A stranger will they not follow. They will flee from him. Jesus says that they will not follow strangers. Well, why would they follow these strangers? Well, what is the stranger doing? The stranger is trying to place themselves into the position of the shepherd. They're trying to place themselves into the position of of the leadership. They're trying to replace the shepherd. So they're displacing the shepherd. They're kicking him out of the way. And this is what the Pharisees are doing. We're going to get into this whole idea of the shepherd later on with the Messiah as we go through it. And we're going to be on this for several weeks because we really want to go deep in this and really understand it. But what were the Pharisees? What were these Jews trying to do? Trying to remove God as being that shepherd. Replacing Jesus Christ. I think it's really interesting. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll look at a verse here and kind of see this playing out. So the third sign is there's the disregard of the sheep, the signs of the stranger. There's a disregard for the sheep. They're trying to displace the shepherd, but then notice the deception of the sheep. Now, notice what he says in verse 5, a stranger will they not follow, will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. The strangers are trying to call the sheep, but the sheep do not know their voice. Okay, so the shepherd would name the sheep. I'm going to call you long tail, I'll call you spotted nose, and I'm going to call you hard-headed. So a stranger would come in, and a stranger may know those names. A stranger may listen and learn how the shepherd is calling them. And so the sheep would come, or a stranger may sneak into the fold. They may come in, or they may come around the sheep, and he would use the same words to grab the attention of the sheep, and then he would call them by those names. But the sheep would not move. Why? It's because they don't recognize the voice. But what are the strangers trying to do? They're trying to deceive the sheep. And so this is exactly what strangers do. This is exactly what those who there's no regard for the well-being of the sheep. It's all about them. They're trying to replace the shepherd. They're trying to replace God. They're trying to remove him. Even in the name of Christ, they'll do this. And then there's the deception of the sheep. Now, I want you to see this playing out. I want you to turn back to John 9. Okay? Now, we'll get when we come to I don't want to read all of it again. We can come to verse 29. Okay. Remember, the guy is blind. He doesn't know who Jesus is. Okay? But what is it that blind people are able to do? They're able to discern voices. Right? You know? So we come to verse number 30. Or verse 29. The Pharisees say, we know that God spake unto Moses, as for this fellow we know not from whence he is. The man answered and said unto them, why herein is a marvelous thing, that you know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes. He says, now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshiper of God and doeth his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, it was not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind. If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. And then what do? Do they answer and said unto him, thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said unto him, dost thou believe on the Son of God? And he answered, who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? Jesus said unto him, thou hast both seen him, and it is he that it is he that talketh with thee. He said, Lord, I believe. Now we mentioned last week when the Lord, that phrase, thou hast both seen him, and it is he which talketh with thee, is implied that Jesus is letting him know, I am the one that healed you. You've seen him, you're looking at him, and it is the one that talketh with thee. Now, how did this guy know that Jesus did that? He would have recognized his voice. He would have recognized his voice. He would have recognized what Jesus had said. Now, what do we see happening right here? The Pharisees are the strangers. The Pharisees are the thieves and the robbers. The Pharisees have just had a conversation with this man, and what did this man not do? He did not hear them. He did not follow them. But then when Jesus shows up, the Lord introduces himself to this man. He is recognizing his voice and realizes this is the one that did it. And so then what does this man do? He follows Jesus Christ. Why? Because Jesus Christ is this man's shepherd. He becomes one of the sheep of Christ. Okay? And so what we have in John 9 is a playing out of what Jesus is explaining to them in John 10. Hey, gentlemen, do you know why people are following me? It's because they hear my voice. They recognize me as the true shepherd of Israel. And we're going to get into the Old Testament about that and how Messiah was going to be the shepherd and things like that, so that there's more context from the Old Testament about that. They say, but brother, didn't a lot of people reject Jesus? Yes. Especially those where Jesus Christ is in Jerusalem. The people of Galilee did not crucify Jesus Christ. The people in like Samaria, the people in Decapolis and around the Sea of Galilee, in all of those areas. No. Who crucified him? It was those Jews in Jerusalem that the Pharisees convinced. They got him on their side. You remember, there's still a lot of fear here with the Pharisees, kicking them out of the synagogue. There's a lot of things going on in Jerusalem, okay? But there are people in Jerusalem later on, as we're going to see in verse number 19 through 24, that, wait a minute. Whoa, wait a minute, guys. Wait a minute. This doesn't have a devil. These are not the words of a devil. He's healing people. And so what the Lord is doing is he is showing to these Jewish people who are a part of the flock of God. They're believers in God and they belong to him. And this is why they're following Christ, because Christ is their true shepherd. And we're going to, hopefully, we'll see that. So what are the signs of a true shepherd? What are the signs of a true shepherd? He has access to the sheep. He attends to them, or the sheep attend to him. They listen. There's affection. He calls them by name. He is accountable to them. And I think it's so awesome that what does the Lord do to the man in John 9? As soon as he hears that he's been kicked out, he goes to him. He shows affection for him. He shows accountability for him. He shows an attachment. You belong to me. I'm coming to take care of you. I'm coming to be here. And so just some awesome things here the Lord is showing these Jewish people about the true shepherd of Christ. And so that's what's going on here. So we'll dive deeper into this next week, and thank God that he is our shepherd. He is the great shepherd of the sheep, and we can hear his voice. We can know him, and he can lead us. And we thank God for that. Amen. Well, we will conclude with that tonight, and we'll continue on next week in the parable and the explanation. Thank you all for coming, and those that are watching. And thank you for tuning in and watching. And may the Lord bless you. And may you have a wonderful week in the Lord.